Hello and welcome. Before we begin, a question for you to consider. If your own government, in the deepest secrecy, discovered a provable, repeatable method for a person to see any place on Earth with their mind alone, do you think they would ever truly tell you about it? Project Stargate. Inside the US government's psychic spy program. The air in the shielded room at Stanford Research Institute always felt static, like the moment before a lightning strike. It was 1973, and I was a young physicist, lured from a promising but predictable career in quantum mechanics by two men, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. They spoke not of particles and waves, but of consciousness and distance. They offered a chance to work on a problem so fundamental, so paradigm-shattering, that it felt like stepping into a science fiction novel. The project, then codenamed Scanate, Scan by Coordinate, was funded by the CIA. The goal was simple, yet utterly insane: to verify if extrasensory perception, specifically what they were beginning to call remote viewing, could be used as an intelligence-gathering tool. My job was to be the skeptic, the control, the man who designed the protocol so tightly that no fraud, conscious or unconscious, could slip through. The room itself was a testament to this rigor. It was a Faraday cage, blocking all known forms of electromagnetic radiation. There was no art on the walls, just beige acoustic tiles. The furniture was government-issue drab. In one corner sat the viewer, a man named Pat Price, a retired police commissioner with a placid, almost boring demeanor that belied the torrent of strange information he could produce. In the other corner, I sat with Hal, the monitor. My role was to remain blind to the target. An independent officer from our agency sponsor would be at a separate, secure location. He would randomly select a set of geographic coordinates from a sealed envelope. Those coordinates, and only those coordinates, would be relayed to me. I would then read them to Price. That was it. No hints, no leading questions, just numbers. On this particular day, the numbers were 49°58N, 87°58E. I wrote them on a fresh sheet of paper and pushed it across the table. Pat, your target is 49 degrees, 58 minutes north, 87 degrees, 58 minutes east. Describe your perceptions. Price closed his eyes. The silence in the room became heavy, broken only by the quiet whir of a tape recorder. For a full 2 minutes, nothing happened. This was the part my skeptical mind loved. The part where I could think, see, it's nothing. Just a man with his eyes closed. Then he began to speak, his voice a low monotone. I'm seeing something big, metal, a crane, a giant gantry crane. It moves on rails. It's huge, towering. It rolls back and forth over something. He paused, frowning. There's a building nearby, a concrete building, no windows, flat roof. There's a strange feeling here, a pressure, an energy. Something important is happening underground beneath the crane. He started sketching on a pad, his hand moving quickly. The drawing showed a massive skeletal crane on a trackway next to a boxy building. He drew details. The operator's cab high up on the structure, the massive hook, the wide-span legs. He continued to add sensory details. The air tastes metallic. There's a low hum, a vibration in the ground. I see men in uniforms, but they're not our guys. The writing on the building, Cyrillic. My own pulse quickened, a traitorous flutter against my scientific detachment. Cyrillic. That put us squarely in the Soviet Union. Hal scribbled notes, his face a mask of concentration. Anything else, Pat? Hal asked, his voice carefully neutral. The thing under the crane, Price said, his eyes still closed. It's a sphere, a big metal sphere. They're assembling it. or working on it. It's hot. Not fire hot, but an energy hot. It feels dangerous. He opened his eyes, looking tired. That's it. That's all I'm getting. Semipalatinsk. The place is called Semipalatinsk. He had not just described a scene. He had named a location, a place none of us in the room had ever heard of. I took his sketch and his transcribed statement, placed them in a sealed folio, and signed it. Hal countersigned. We were done for the day. 3 weeks later, a CIA analyst, a man with pale eyes and a perpetually worried expression, visited our lab. He laid 2 images on the table. One was Pat Price's sketch. The other was a brand new high-resolution satellite photograph of a top-secret Soviet nuclear facility at Semipalatinsk, taken after a satellite had been retasked based on our report. The coordinates we had given Price were for a point in the empty wilderness miles away. We did that sometimes, a displaced coordinate test. But his mind hadn't gone to the empty field. It had locked onto the nearest site of significant activity. And in the photograph, clear as day, was a massive gantry crane on rails, next to a concrete building, exactly as he had described. The analyst pointed to the crane. Our photo interpreters have been arguing about this for months. They thought it was for constructing submarine components. They never imagined the Soviets could build a gantry this big out here. Price's description of a sphere, of an underground nuclear device assembly, has just fundamentally changed our entire assessment of the Soviet peaceful atom program. He looked at me, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence in front of him. How in God's name is this possible? I had no answer. I just looked at the sketch and the photo, side by side. The neat lines of physics I had built my life upon were beginning to crack. And through those cracks, something vast and unknown was looking back. The Semipalatinsk hit changed everything. The trickle of funding from the CIA became a steady stream. Our small corner at SRI began to expand. More shielded rooms were built. We recruited more viewers, each with their own unique style. There was Hella Hamid, a photographer whose perceptions were intensely visual and artistic, and Ingo Swan, an artist from New York who was more of a theorist than a performer. Ingo was the one who pushed us, who insisted we treat this not as a parlor trick, but as a trainable, human faculty. He railed against the term ESP, preferring remote perception. He argued that the mind wasn't receiving a signal in the traditional sense, but was somehow accessing a universal matrix of information, a sort of cosmic database. It was Ingo who developed the rigorous, multi-stage protocol that would become the standard for the military units that followed. The process was designed to bypass the conscious, analytical mind, which we learned was the greatest enemy of clear viewing. The analytical mind tries to name things too quickly, to fit strange perceptions into familiar boxes. We called this analytic overlay, or AOL, and it was the source of most errors. A viewer might perceive long, thin, dark, and moving, and their mind would shout, "Snake!" when the target was actually a river seen from high above. The protocol was designed to keep the viewer in a state of pure perception, describing only raw sensory data, gestalts. I'm sensing something hard and flat and man-made. Across and up. Energy. The monitor's job was to guide them gently, using only the viewer's own words. Tell me more about across. Describe the energy. It was a slow, painstaking process, like an archaeologist brushing dust from a fossil. Our primary customer was now the Defense Intelligence Agency. The atmosphere shifted from academic exploration to operational urgency. The targets were no longer random coordinates in a desert. They were real-world intelligence problems. A downed Soviet Tu-95 bomber lost somewhere in the African jungle. A suspected chemical weapons plant in Libya. A hostage situation. My job as protocol keeper and resident skeptic became infinitely more difficult. The pressure to produce actionable intelligence was immense. Every session was recorded, transcribed, and analyzed with a fine-toothed comb. We weren't just looking for curiosities anymore. We were looking for data that could save lives or give the US a strategic advantage in the Cold War. A typical operation would begin with a call from our DIA handler, a man we'll call Colonel Stevens. He was a stone-faced career intelligence officer, utterly pragmatic. He didn't care how it worked, he only cared if it worked. He'd arrive with a sealed courier pouch. Inside would be a single sheet of paper with the target, often encrypted or identified only by a code word. I would prepare the target package, which consisted of nothing more than the coordinates or the code word on a blank card. The viewer would be brought into the room, having been kept in isolation for hours beforehand to clear their mind. Let's take the case of the lost bomber. The target was Project Whirlwind. The viewer was Joseph McMonigal, a quiet, intense Army intelligence officer who had been in a near-death experience. He became our most reliable asset, our viewer 001. I passed him the card. Joe, your target is Project Whirlwind. Joe closed his eyes. The familiar silence descended. Then, green. Overwhelming green. Wet. The air is thick, I can't breathe. Smell of rot, of decay. And something else. Smell of burnt wires. Kerosene. This was the first stage. The raw sensory input. Tell me more about the burnt wires smell, I'd prompt. It's sharp, acrid. It's connected to something metallic. Twisted, broken metal. A lot of it. It's not supposed to be here. It fell from the sky. He was getting closer. The next stage involved shapes, dimensions. I'm getting a sense of something long and cylindrical, broken in the middle, a wing shape, but it's wrong. It's bent at a sick angle. There's a star, a red star painted on the side. My pen flew across the page. A red star. That was the confirmation. We were on the right track. But Africa is a big place. Stevens needed a location. Joe, move your awareness outward. Perceive the surrounding landscape. What do you see? This was the hardest part, asking the viewer to essentially act as a human satellite. Water. A river. It's brown, muddy. It curves like a snake. There's a mountain. A strange-shaped mountain nearby. It looks like a sleeping woman. He sketched the shape of the river's bend and the unique profile of the mountain. He couldn't give us coordinates. The faculty didn't work like GPS. It provided landmarks, sensory snapshots. We sent the transcript and sketches to the DIA. 2 weeks later, Colonel Stevens returned. He didn't smile. He never smiled. But the tension in his shoulders was gone. Your man's Sleeping Woman Mountain was a known local landmark in northern Zaire. We focused the satellite search grids in that area. We found the crash site yesterday. He paused, looking at the transcript. The pilot's body was in the cockpit. The flight recorder was intact. Your man McMonigal's description of burnt wires and kerosene. The after-action report says the initial fire in the cockpit was electrical. He shook his head slowly. Don't ask me to explain it. Just be ready for the next target. The work was draining, not just for the viewers, but for all of us. We lived in a grey world of secrets and shadows, straddling the line between known science and the utterly inexplicable. The successes were exhilarating, but they were punctuated by failures, by sessions that produced nothing but mental noise and gibberish. For every hit, like the bomber, there were 3 misses that left us frustrated and full of doubt. The signal-to-noise ratio was a constant battle. And in the back of my mind, the fundamental question always loomed: what exactly was this signal we were tapping into? Where was this information coming from? The implications were terrifying. The move from SRI's academic setting to a dedicated military unit at Fort Meade, Maryland, was a culture shock. The project was given a new, permanent name: Stargate. The beige walls were replaced with government green. The relaxed, inquisitive atmosphere of California was gone, replaced by the rigid, compartmentalized structure of the intelligence community. We were no longer scientists studying a phenomenon. We were intelligence assets, cogs in the vast machine of national security. I was given a civilian rank equivalent to a lieutenant colonel and a security clearance that made my old one look like a library card. My job remained the same on paper: protocol design, data analysis, and monitoring sessions. But the stakes were infinitely higher. The viewers were now almost exclusively military personnel, like Joe McMoneagle, who had been hand-picked for their perceived psychic aptitude and, more importantly, their discipline and loyalty. They weren't quirky artists anymore. They were soldiers. This new environment brought a new level of pressure. The failures were no longer just academic disappointments. They were intelligence failures that could have real-world consequences. One such failure still haunts me. We were tasked with locating a KGB defector who had gone missing in Vienna. The man, codenamed Cardinal, possessed critical information about Soviet operations in Western Europe. The fear was that he had been abducted by a wet team for repatriation and execution. The pressure from the top was immense. The viewer for this session was a young Marine captain, a new recruit to the program who had shown promise. He was eager, perhaps too eager. I sat across from him in the sterile, soundproofed room at Fort Meade. The only object on the table was the target card, which read, Cardinal. The session started poorly. The viewer's breathing was shallow, a sign of anxiety. His initial perceptions were a jumble of noise. I see a city, old buildings, cobblestones. That was generic, a postcard image of Vienna. His analytical mind was already taking over, trying to guess the answer. Push the image away. I coached, my voice calm. Stay with the raw data. What are the gestalts? He tried again. Cold. I feel cold. A damp stone feeling. Darkness. This was better. Raw sensory data. Tell me more about the darkness. It's enclosed, small. I hear dripping water. A metallic smell, like rust. His description began to form a coherent picture. A cellar, a dungeon, some kind of underground prison. He described the feeling of fear, of despair. He saw another man in the room with Cardinal, a large, brutal figure. He heard words in Russian, threats. The session ended with the viewer convinced that Cardinal was being held captive in the basement of an old building near a canal. The data was compelling, detailed, and emotionally resonant. It was passed up the chain of command. CIA assets in Vienna spent a week frantically but discreetly searching cellars and basements in the district the viewer had described. They found nothing. The trail went cold. 10 days later, we received the final report. Cardinal had not been abducted. He had gotten cold feet, walked into the Soviet embassy of his own free will, and redefected. The entire abduction scenario had been a fabrication of the viewer's own anxieties and imagination, a perfect storm of analytic overlay. He had wanted so badly to succeed, to be the hero, that his mind had constructed a narrative that fit the expected outcome. The failure was a black mark on the project. It highlighted our greatest vulnerability, the human element. The signal, whatever it was, passed through the filter of a human mind with all its biases, fears, memories, and desires. The monitor's job was to help the viewer separate the signal from this internal noise, but sometimes the noise was a deafening roar. The incident led to even more stringent protocols. We implemented double-blind procedures where neither the viewer nor the monitor knew the target. An independent officer would simply tell me, "We're doing target 7B today." And I would say to the viewer, "Your target is 7B." This prevented me from unconsciously leading the viewer, even with my body language or tone of voice. We also began to focus more on technical, non-emotional targets. The layout of a new Soviet submarine, the energy signature of a particle beam weapon, the chemical composition of a new type of rocket fuel. These targets were less susceptible to emotional overlay. Yet the successes continued to be just as inexplicable as the failures. In one session, Joe McMoneagle was tasked with a set of coordinates inside China. He described, in incredible detail, a large building where a new type of attack submarine was being constructed. He drew the submarine's unique teardrop hull and described a strange, new propulsion system, a detail that was completely unknown to Western intelligence. He called it a whoosh sound, not the familiar churning of a propeller. Months later, spy satellites confirmed the existence of the new submarine class, the Han class, at the exact location. And when our naval intelligence finally got acoustic data on it, they found it was powered by a pump jet propulsor, a technology we didn't think the Chinese possessed, which made a distinct low-frequency whoosh. How did Joe know that? He wasn't a naval engineer. He'd never even seen a submarine up close. He couldn't explain it, and I couldn't either. We were riding a tiger. We knew we could be thrown off at any moment, but the power we occasionally managed to harness was too great to simply let go. The project continued, a strange duality of spectacular success and crushing failure, hidden deep within the labyrinth of the Pentagon. The operational tempo at Fort Meade was relentless. We were an enigma within the intelligence community, a special access program that existed in the shadows. Most people who worked in the building had no idea what happened behind the cipher-locked door of our unit, officially designated Detachment G. They saw us as spooks among spooks, a source of rumor and suspicion. Our successes, like the Chinese submarine and the lost Soviet bomber, were classified at such a high level that they couldn't be used to justify our existence to the wider bureaucracy. Our failures, however, had a tendency to leak, reinforcing the belief among our detractors that we were a boondoggle, a nest of government-funded charlatans. The man who shielded us from this political flak was Major General Albert Stubblebine III, the commanding general of the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, INSCOM. Stubblebine was a true believer. He wasn't just a consumer of our intelligence product. He was a passionate advocate for the potential of the human mind. He believed that remote viewing was just the tip of the iceberg, and he pushed us to explore the outer limits of the phenomenon. "Don't just tell me where the tank is," he'd say in briefings, his eyes gleaming with intensity. "I want you to tell me what the driver is thinking. I want you to tell me where he's going to be tomorrow." This led us into the treacherous territory of viewing future events and human intent. From a scientific perspective, this was a nightmare. If viewing a static object in the present was difficult, trying to perceive a future event that had not yet happened and was subject to the whims of human free will was exponentially harder. The data we got from these sessions was often highly symbolic, like a dream. It was less a clear seeing and more a vague premonition. The Iran hostage crisis in 1979 became a major focus for the unit. The entire US government was desperate for any scrap of information. Where were the hostages being held? Were they alive? What were the captors' plans? We ran dozens of sessions. The viewers, primarily Joe McMoneagle and another gifted individual we'll call Hart, were put on the target day after day. The pressure was unimaginable. Hart, in one session, described a specific building in Tehran. He drew its floor plan with remarkable accuracy. A large central room, offices branching off, a specific pattern of tiles on the floor. He described the emotional state of the hostages, a mixture of profound boredom, fear, and flashes of defiance. He smelled the dust, the stale cigarette smoke, the scent of lamb stew cooking. He heard the cadence of Farsi prayers from a nearby mosque. Most chillingly, he described one hostage who was being kept in a separate location, in a storage room, and was suffering from a severe illness. He said the man was being secretly treated by a sympathetic Iranian doctor. This data was tantalizing. It felt real, but it wasn't actionable in a military sense. "Tell us which building," the DIA would demand. But the viewers couldn't pluck a street name out of the ether. They were at the location, but they couldn't read the street signs. It was like being a ghost, able to perceive but not interact. After the hostages were finally released, debriefings confirmed many of the details Hart and Joe had provided. A group of the hostages had been held for a time in a building whose floor plan matched Hart's sketch. The sensory details were corroborated, and it was confirmed that one hostage, Richard Queen, had developed multiple sclerosis and had been kept isolated from the others, receiving medical care before being granted an early release. The viewers had been right. The information was correct, but it hadn't helped get them out any faster. This was the core dilemma of Stargate. We could produce information that was often startlingly accurate, but it was rarely precise enough for military planners. It was like having a blurry photograph of the battlefield. You could see the general shape of things, but you couldn't count the enemy soldiers or identify their weaponry. Stubblebine's push into more esoteric areas continued. He wanted us to try remote influencing, to see if a viewer could affect a person or a machine at a distance. We ran experiments trying to disrupt the output of a random number generator or to subtly plant a thought in a test subject's mind. The results were statistically tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive, far too unreliable for any practical application. The work began to take a heavy toll on the viewers. Living with one foot in this world and one in the matrix, as Ingo Swann called it, was profoundly disorienting. They suffered from migraines, nervous exhaustion, and a kind of psychic burnout. One viewer described it as having the background noise of the entire world constantly whispering in your ear. They saw things they didn't want to see. The raw misery of a famine, the terror of a soldier in battle, the cold emptiness of a Siberian gulag. Joe McMoneagle had to develop a strict mental discipline, a way of shutting the door when a session was over, just to stay sane. The line between perception and imagination blurred. Was the flash of a car crash they saw a premonition or just a stray thought? The constant self-doubt was corrosive. We were charting an unknown sea without a map or a compass, and we were beginning to realize that here there be dragons, not external monsters, but the ones lurking within the unnavigated depths of the human psyche. The project was becoming more powerful and more dangerous than any of us had ever anticipated. The deeper we waded into the murky waters of Stargate, the more the ethical lines began to blur. In the early days at SRI, our targets were mostly neutral: a building, a geographical feature, a piece of technology. But under the DIA and the bellicose guidance of General Stubblebine, the targets became more personal, more intrusive. The logic was cold and simple. If we had a tool that could potentially uncover a threat to national security, we had a duty to use it. This led us to target people. Not just foreign adversaries, but sometimes individuals who were not, strictly speaking, enemies of the state. One of the most disquieting series of sessions involved a tasking to locate a suspected mole within the US intelligence community in Europe. The target wasn't a name, but a concept. The source of the leak. It was a new kind of target, abstract and defined by an action. The viewer for this session was a man named Tom Nance, a former naval intelligence specialist with a knack for perceiving complex systems. The session began with Tom describing a feeling of duality, of wearing a mask. He saw a man in an office, surrounded by American paraphernalia, but felt a sense of cold detachment, of playing a role. He described the man's physical characteristics: middle-aged, thinning hair, a fondness for a particular brand of European cigarette. He perceived the man's motivations not as ideological, but as financial. "It's about money," Tom said, his voice flat. "He feels underappreciated, passed over for promotion. There's a deep-seated resentment." He then described a data stream, a flow of information moving from a secure teletype machine to a briefcase, and then to a drop point in a public park. The details were specific. A particular bench near a fountain in Geneva. The transcript was sent to the Counterintelligence Division. I never received an official debriefing on the outcome. The information simply vanished into the maw of the security state. But 6 months later, I read a small sanitized report in an internal digest about a CIA officer in Geneva who had been quietly retired due to personal misconduct. The description of the officer was a perfect match for what Tom had perceived. Had we just conducted a psychic manhunt? Had we pointed the finger at a man based on the mental impressions of a viewer sitting in a windowless room a continent away? My scientific training screamed that this was madness. There was no chain of evidence, no due process. Yet the operational reality was that the information appeared to be correct. I confided my unease to Hal Puthoff during one of his visits to Fort Meade. Hal, ever the physicist, saw it in terms of information theory. "Alex," he said, "we're accessing a field of information. The field doesn't have an ethical compass. It just is. It contains information about a supernova in the Andromeda Galaxy and information about a traitor in Geneva. The ethics are determined by the user, not the tool. But that was little comfort. We, the team, were the ones directing the tool. The viewers were the ones who had to swim in that amoral sea of information. The work grew darker. We were tasked with tracking Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, trying to anticipate his movements and plans. One viewer, in a particularly disturbing session, described being inside Gaddafi's mind. He didn't just see Gaddafi's location, he felt his paranoia, his megalomania, his rage. The viewer was physically ill for 2 days afterward, complaining of a toxic residue he couldn't shake. He said it was like being mentally slimed. We were also used in counter-narcotics operations, tracking the movements of drug cartel leaders in South America. In one famous case, a viewer successfully identified a series of remote jungle airstrips used by Pablo Escobar's cartel, locations that were completely unknown to the DEA. The information led to a series of raids that seized tons of cocaine. On the surface, this was a clear win. But it also meant we were using this extraordinary ability to fight the war on drugs, a task far removed from our original national security mandate. We were becoming a kind of psychic Swiss Army knife for the intelligence community, used for whatever problem was pressing that day. The most dangerous territory we entered was targeting our own side. On one occasion, a sensitive document went missing from a secure facility in Washington. There was a panic. An investigation was launched, but it was turning up nothing. In desperation, our unit was tasked. The target was simply the location of the missing document. Joe McMonigal did the session. He relaxed, closed his eyes, and after a few minutes of silence, he described the document not in a briefcase or a foreign embassy, but inside the secure facility itself. He saw it slipped, fallen between a large grey metal safe and the wall. He described the specific room, the position of the safe. A security team was dispatched. They pulled the multi-ton safe away from the wall, and there, covered in dust, was the missing document. It had simply been misplaced. A crisis was averted, but the implications were staggering. We had the ability to peer inside our own secure facilities, to bypass the very security systems we were a part of. What if a viewer had been a mole? The potential for abuse was breathtaking. We were walking a razor's edge and the ground beneath us was crumbling. The question was no longer if. The technology worked, but whether we, as flawed human beings, could be trusted to wield it. By the mid-1980s, the Stargate program was at its zenith and also at its most precarious. The Cold War was in its final convulsive stages. The rhetoric from the Reagan administration was aggressive, and the intelligence community was tasked with providing any possible edge against the evil empire. Our unit, now deeply embedded within the DIA's operational structure, was working constantly. We had a core group of about 6 reliable military viewers and a rotating cast of others in training. The budget was secret, but it was substantial enough to keep us in shielded rooms and secure computer systems. General Stubblebine's influence provided top cover, allowing us to operate with a degree of autonomy that was unheard of for such an unorthodox program. This period saw some of our most astonishing technical hits. We were tasked with finding a new type of Soviet submarine that intelligence knew existed but had never been able to photograph. All they had was a name from a human source: Typhoon. The problem was, they didn't know what it looked like or where it was based. One of our viewers, a Navy chief petty officer, was given the target Typhoon. He began his session by describing an immense black object under the ice of the Arctic. "It's wrong," he kept saying. "It's too wide. It's like 2 submarines strapped together." He sketched a vessel with a unique flattened top and a wide beam, completely unlike any known submarine design. He also described the location, a specific naval base on the Kola Peninsula, noting a covered pier and unique ice-breaking tugboats nearby. The data was passed to the Navy. Analysts were skeptical. The design was too unconventional, but they retasked a satellite to focus on the naval base the viewer had described. Weeks later, the call came. A Typhoon-class submarine, the largest submarine ever built, had been photographed for the first time. Its design was just as the viewer had described: a wide-beam, double-hulled configuration designed to break through the Arctic ice. It was a staggering intelligence coup. But for every spectacular success, there was a background hum of ambiguity and failure. The signal-to-noise problem never went away. We were still wrestling with the fact that remote viewing was more of an art than a science. Some days a viewer would be on, their perceptions clear and verifiable. Other days, they would produce nothing but noise, their minds clouded by what they'd had for lunch or an argument with their spouse. There was no way to predict or control it. This inherent unreliability made many in the intelligence mainstream deeply uncomfortable. They wanted a tool that worked every time, like a camera or a listening device. We were offering them a temperamental artist. The fallibility was highlighted during the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. In the frantic aftermath, we were tasked with locating the perpetrators. The viewers provided a torrent of data: descriptions of the men, the truck they used, the building where the bomb was assembled. The information was vivid, emotionally charged, and felt incredibly real, but it led nowhere. The descriptions were too general to identify specific individuals, and the locations were ephemeral. We pinpointed a dozen possible safe houses, but none of them panned out. The frustration was immense. We could see the tragedy, but we couldn't deliver justice. The culture of the program was also becoming strange. The line between being an operator and being a true believer was getting thinner. Stubblebine and some of his subordinates began exploring even more fringe concepts, things that made remote viewing look mundane by comparison. Attempts at psychokinesis, bending spoons which never worked, efforts to phase through walls, and even attempts to remotely kill a goat, which also, thankfully, never worked. I and some of the other more grounded members of the team saw this as a dangerous diversion. We were fighting for scientific and operational credibility, and this new age drift was threatening to turn us into a laughingstock. I argued fiercely that we should stick to the core Stargate protocol, information gathering, as it was the only application with a verifiable track record. My protests were noted but largely ignored by the true believers in command. The schism was growing between the operational wing of the program, who just wanted good intel, and the phenomenological wing, who wanted to explore the nature of consciousness itself. We were a house divided. The beginning of the end came with a change in leadership. General Stubblebine retired in 1984. His replacement was a far more conventional by-the-book officer who looked at Stargate with a deeply skeptical eye. The political protection we had enjoyed for years began to evaporate. Simultaneously, the Cold War itself was beginning to thaw. The clear, existential threat that had justified our unorthodox methods was diminishing. In a world of glasnost and perestroika, a top-secret psychic spy program started to seem less like a vital necessity and more like an expensive anachronism. We were still producing good data. We were instrumental in tracking mobile Scud missile launches during the first Gulf War, but the political winds had shifted. The questions from congressional oversight committees became more pointed. The knives, long held at bay by our patrons, were beginning to come out. We could all feel it. The static in the air was no longer the prelude to a psychic breakthrough, but the sound of an axe being sharpened. The final years of Stargate, from the late 1980s into the early 1990s, were a slow, grinding retreat. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was, paradoxically, a disaster for us. Our primary adversary, the raison d'être for so much of our work, was dissolving. The intelligence budget, once a gushing fire hose, was being squeezed, and fringe programs like ours were the first to come under scrutiny. Our name was changed again, this time to a series of bland rotating code words like Sunstreak and Scanate, in a futile attempt to hide from our budget-cutting pursuers in the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. The unit was downsized. Several of our best viewers, sensing the end was near, retired or moved to other, more stable assignments. The sense of mission and excitement was replaced by a grim determination to simply survive. We were ghosts, haunting the hallways of the DIA, a relic of a stranger, more paranoid time. The final official mission I monitored was in 1994. The task was to locate a North Korean nuclear research facility that was suspected to be hidden in a vast, mountainous region. Traditional intelligence assets had failed to pinpoint it. It was a classic Stargate target, a needle in a haystack. The viewer was a veteran, a man who had been with the program for over a decade. He was tired, burned out, but a true professional. The session was a textbook example of the protocol. He started with the raw gestalts, hard, angular, man-made, inside a mountain, deep inside, a feeling of immense energy. controlled but barely. A feeling of danger. He described tunnels, large caverns excavated from the rock. He drew a diagram of the facility's layout, 3 large chambers connected by a central corridor. He perceived the specific type of rock, granite, and the presence of a large underground river that the facility was using for cooling. The data was, by our standards, excellent. It was specific, technical, and internally consistent. It was passed up the chain, but the response was lukewarm. A few years earlier, this report would have had satellites retasked and analysts working around the clock. Now, it was met with a shrug. Interesting, our DIA handler said, but we have no way to verify it without sending in a team, and that's not going to happen. The report was filed away, another piece of potentially vital but ultimately non-actionable intelligence. The world had changed. The risk calculus was different. A psychic's hunch, no matter how detailed, wasn't enough to justify a major geopolitical incident. A few months later, the official notice came down. The CIA, which had birthed the program 2 decades earlier, was taking it back from the DIA, ostensibly for the purpose of conducting a thorough, independent evaluation of its effectiveness. We all knew what that meant. It was a bureaucratic execution. The agency chosen to conduct the review was the American Institutes for Research, AIR. They sent in a team of statisticians and psychologists who had no background in intelligence or the unique nature of our work. They looked at our files, a mountain of raw data from thousands of sessions over 20 years. I was tasked with providing them with our greatest hits: the Semipalatinsk crane, the Typhoon submarine, the lost bomber in Zaire. I presented the data, the sketches, the corroborating satellite photos. I explained the protocols, the concept of signal versus noise, the challenges of analytic overlay. They listened politely, but their minds were already made up. They were looking at it from a purely statistical standpoint. They saw the many sessions that produced ambiguous or incorrect data as simple failures. They discounted the spectacular successes as statistical anomalies or lucky guesses. They couldn't fit the square peg of a psychic phenomenon into the round hole of their conventional scientific methodology. They were unable or unwilling to grapple with the central mystery. How could a man in a room in Maryland accurately draw a secret submarine in the Arctic? To them, it was an outlier to be dismissed, not a clue to a new understanding of reality. Their final report, issued in 1995, was a death sentence. It concluded that the remote viewing phenomenon is not a reliable intelligence-gathering tool, and that the program has failed to produce actionable intelligence of a quality and accuracy sufficient to justify its continued funding. It was over. The unit was disbanded. The files were boxed up, stamped with a final classified, and sent to an archive. The viewers and staff were reassigned or retired. We were instructed never to speak of our work. Project Stargate, after more than 2 decades and $20 million, officially ceased to exist. I walked out of Fort Meade for the last time with a profound sense of loss and unresolved ambiguity. Had we been fools? Deluded mystics in government clothing? Or had we been pioneers, standing on the shore of an undiscovered continent, only to be ordered back into the boat by men who refused to believe their eyes? The answer, I believe, is both. The years after Stargate's termination were quiet. I returned to the world of academia, taking a position teaching physics at a small university. I never spoke of what I had done. My time at SRI and Fort Meade felt like a strange dream, a secret history that only a handful of us shared. When the Stargate files were declassified in the late 1990s, the story that emerged was a caricature, a simplified tale of spoon-bending generals and psychic spies that was easy to mock and dismiss. The AIR report became the official, final word. The program was a failure, case closed. But for those of us who were there, who sat in the sterile rooms and witnessed the impossible happen, the story is far more complex. I think about Pat Price, the retired cop, sketching a Soviet atomic weapons facility from 4,000 miles away. I think about Joe McMoneagle describing the unique propulsion system of a submarine he'd never seen. I think about Hart describing the illness of a hostage in Tehran. These were not lucky guesses. They were not statistical anomalies. They were moments when the veil of ordinary reality seemed to thin, revealing something extraordinary underneath. The AIR report correctly identified the program's primary weakness: its unreliability. The signal-to-noise ratio was a problem we never solved. For every stunning hit, there were frustrating misses and sessions filled with confusing, dreamlike gibberish. Intelligence agencies need reliability. A spy satellite works on a clear day. A phone tap records what is said. Stargate offered no such guarantees. It was, as one critic aptly put it, like having a scout who was a brilliant observer but also a pathological liar, and you never knew which one you were talking to. And yet, was the program a failure? It depends on the metric. Did it win the Cold War? No. Did it provide a consistent, reliable stream of actionable intelligence? No. But did it prove, at least to those of us who witnessed it firsthand, that the human mind possesses capabilities that are not yet understood by mainstream science? For me, the answer is an unequivocal yes. We were tasked by the government to answer a simple question. Can a person perceive information from a great distance, shielded from all known sensory input? After 20 years of research, my answer is yes. The implications of that simple yes are more profound than any single piece of intelligence we ever gathered. It suggests that the nature of consciousness, time and space, are far more interconnected and mysterious than our current scientific models allow. We are more than just biological machines, more than just the neurons firing in our brains. The failure of Stargate wasn't in the phenomenon, but in our attempt to weaponize it, to force something wild and untamable into the rigid, predictable box of military intelligence gathering. It was like trying to harness lightning with a key and a kite. You might get a spark. You might even learn something about the nature of electricity, but you're never going to power a city with it. It's too unpredictable, too dangerous. Sometimes, late at night in my office, surrounded by textbooks filled with the neat, elegant equations of physics, I'll pull out a single, dog-eared piece of paper I kept from my time in the program. It's a copy of Pat Price's original sketch of the Semipalatinsk gantry crane. I look at the crude drawing, the hurried handwriting describing the hum of energy and the taste of metal in the air, and I compare it to the declassified satellite photo, the cold, hard proof. In that moment, the skepticism and the certainty, the successes and the failures, all collapse into a single, haunting question. We spent 20 years and millions of dollars to build a secret program around the most profound and mysterious human faculty. We proved to ourselves that it was real. And then, when it proved too difficult, too strange, too uncontrollable for our purposes, we simply shut it down, classified the evidence, and pretended it never happened. We looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back, and we blinked. I am an old man now, and I have come to believe that the true legacy of Stargate is not in the intelligence it produced, but in the fundamental question it forced us to ask. A question that still hangs in the air, unanswered. What are the true limits of human potential, and are we brave enough to find out? The files are open now. You can look up the reports, the sketches, the data,